Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes because there's a lot of people waiting in the lobby. So you can see that people are coming through gradually. I think there's about 71 of you all on the call, which is wonderful to see. My name is Joy Johnston. I'm one of the board directors for the English Ice Hockey Association. And the rest of the board are on the call with me. So Andrew Miller, Travis Ward, Ken Taggart and Charles Dakers are all here also. Before we get started, in this new world that we're living in, a lot of us are used to probably video calls already and the way that they're operating, but we thought it would be helpful just to set some kind of ground rules of how we've set this video call up. As I said, there's 73 of you at the moment and counting coming into the meeting, so that's quite a lot of us online. The way we've set the meeting up is that you don't have access to cameras or microphones. We didn't think it was appropriate or fair to ask you to open up your personal homes and your private life to everyone across the hockey world. So your cameras aren't switched on. In terms of asking questions, we want you to use the chat function. So you can type in a question to any of the technical co-hosts for the meeting. So that would be myself, Andrew Miller or Travis Ward. That question comes directly to one of us that you choose. If we're not the right person to answer that question, then we'll pass it across to the right person on the board who is. We would ask you, when you type your question in, if you are comfortable with your name being read out next to that question, or if you would prefer it to just be an anonymous question. And we hope actually that encourages more questions to come forward, because it's an opportunity to send your questions in and to get them answered. So that's how we're going to run the meeting. We have probably about a 30-minute presentation for you, which goes through probably the journey that we've been on from a governance perspective and answers some of those questions that we've already had through to us and that we know are there. And then we are going to open up to answer those questions that you guys have all tuned in for. And so I should probably say thank you very much. It's fantastic that we've got so many people on. Probably having the national lockdown on a Saturday with everyone at home helps us. But it also shows that this is really a critical time for us as an organisation, and that a lot of you are interested and want to be involved in making sure that we make the right decision for the organisation going forward. So thank you for giving us your time. In terms of what the meeting is about, it is a question and answer session primarily, so we don't want to spend too long with presentations and you hearing from us. But we do want to give some context to it, so we've got some slides to go through. And then it's an opportunity for you to ask those questions that you need to ask of us. It's not the only opportunity. You can certainly contact any of us individually over email or by phone, but it is an opportunity where we're here live, if you're attending this live, to be able to ask those questions as we're presenting. It isn't a soapbox situation where you get to stand up and try and convince other people of your point of view. I'm sure you've got enough other platforms that you can use for that and enough other opportunities. So this genuinely is about you getting the answers to the questions that you need so that you can make the decision that you believe is right for the sport. Before we start the meeting, I want to be really clear, and I think the board want to be really clear about what our motivations are and what we really care about. We know what the membership care about, and it's the same as what we care about. We've all been thrown into an environment and a world that none of us foresaw at the start of this year. We want to get back to our sport. We want hockey back. You know, my operational role in the sport, I'm looking after 350 referees that are used to getting abused every weekend, and they're just not happy. You know, they want to be back out on the ice. And we know that players, coaches, parents, anyone that's involved in our sport, we know we want, the main focus is about getting our sport back. To suggest otherwise is unfair. So we know what the hockey community care about. We know what you care about. But we do have an AGM coming up. And as a sport, we do have a pretty significant decision to make. But it's really important that we place that decision in the context of what's happening now and why it is a really key decision in terms of us getting back up and running and being effective as a sport. So before we get into the details of the resolutions, the upcoming AGM and the vote, we want to make sure that we cover off some of the questions that you're all going to have about when can you get back to playing a sport that you love playing, and what's going to happen next week after the national lockdown is lifted and we're all back into tiers. So I'm going to hand over to one of my co-directors, Andrew, to talk about the Return to Play initiative.
Thanks, Joy. I did just put a message on the chat that we're going to be going live on Facebook now, just so that those people that either haven't signed up for this session or people that want to watch at a later point are able to do so. And also just to make clear that we are recording the session as well, so that we can release a recording to the membership at a later point. So I have pressed the go button on Facebook Live, so hopefully that'll be live for everybody to watch now. So yeah, obviously it's really disappointing that we've not been on the ice very much over the last 9 months, and yeah, we've obviously been working really hard behind the scenes to get everybody back on the ice. So next slide, please, Joy. So you'll be familiar with a lot of the requirements that we've already put in place for everybody, so I won't dwell too much in terms of what's kind of involved in that, but obviously all the hand sanitisation, the non-sharing of equipment and so on, that all the clubs have already been following and that everybody should already be aware of as a sport. Next slide, please, Joy. We just wanted to make really clear kind of what we've done as a body, and in essence run really quickly through what that looks like for our sport. So what you're seeing on the page now is actually the flowchart given to us by DCMS. They in essence define kind of the risk in the activity that takes place. And the first point is whether or not it's within 1 meter of another person. The second point is whether or not that activity takes face to face or not. And then the third point is then whether or not that interaction is classed as a fleeting interaction based on a period of either less than 3 seconds or more than 3 seconds. If it kind of fits into that medium risk category, then there's then a question on whether or not there's an accumulation of more than 15 minutes of proximity to a person, which again is identified as one of the primary risk factors. So in essence, as a sport, our primary goal is to stay more than 2 meters away from somebody else, because that in essence is outside of a stick length. But clearly there are a number of interactions in our sport where that's not the case. So we've had to look at those to in essence mitigate those risks through the game that we play. I've just received a message into the chat to ask if we can make this flowchart bigger. Unfortunately not from the slide presentation, but we will make this publicly available afterwards, and some of this information is already online from government anyway. Next slide, please. So in essence, looking at those same risk levels and looking at what that looks like for our sport, there's different areas that in essence you can't be at a greater distance than 1 meter. A really good example of that is a handshake. Clearly that is a really good etiquette part of our sport, but actually isn't part of the sporting requirement. So that's a really easy thing for us to eliminate as a sport. One of the really difficult things for us to eliminate is if you deliver a body check and you end up in a face-to-face position. Predominantly, that's probably going to be on a board. And therefore, it's about how we eliminate that interaction as quickly as possible and keep that time period to less than 3 seconds. Next slide, please, Joy. Equally, there's parts of our game where we spend more than 15 minutes. So again, looking at the changing rooms that we have, and again, these are just indicative, and I'm sure a number of you have already started to work with your venues to do some of these things. But again, making sure that we can stay socially distanced throughout, and all of these protocols have been tested through the NIHL pilot series that we've done, with the final 2 games taking place this weekend. So in essence, if you normally operate within 1 dressing room, give or take, you are likely to require at least 2 dressing rooms to ensure social distancing. That being said, it clearly does depend per dressing room. And just in the example that's on the screen now, based on Sheffield as a venue, what's classed as home and away team dressing room in EIHA Sheffield has 13 spaces, whilst the alternate dressing rooms in the venue actually only have 11. So it's really important that is done on a venue specific basis, because it's going to be venue specific in terms of your dressing room layout. Next slide, please, Joy. Again, there's certain areas of our game that we can't change necessarily. So benches are a really good example of that. So clearly we have a certain number of people on a bench. However, we are looking at reducing the number of off-ice roles. So ordinarily you could have 6 on a bench, and we're reducing that to 3. Equally, it's how that bench is managed in order to have social distancing where possible, but equally where social distancing isn't possible, to in essence make players work in bubbles. So if you have been watching the pilot streaming games, I know, for example, in Swindon, Steve and the team at Swindon have really adapted this very well, expanding the benches to make sure that they provide the maximum amount of space available, whilst clearly in a venue like Sheffield, that's much more difficult. And therefore it's up to the bench management team to try and make sure that players stay within their bubble, so that again, we limit those interactions where the primary risk in our sport is actually from our own teammates rather than the opposition. Next slide, please, Joe. The final part of that, and very much aligned to the government announcement that came out this week around the permitted use of spectators in venues within Tier 1 and Tier 2 areas, is how we segment the athlete areas from the spectator areas, because again, it's about limiting that interaction between those groups. So again, it limits that risk. So what in essence we're asking is for people to make sure that we limit those interactions between those groups as much as possible, and consider that in our planning. So for example, if you're trying to limit the number of spectators because you don't have suitable spaces, then it might be, as an example, that we only have one parent allowed in a rink. Or it might be that if you've got a 3,000 seat arena to be able to play in, like a rink like Coventry, that you can only operate to a 50% capacity, or a maximum limit of 1,000, which is the government guidelines that are going to be published shortly. So they're all the things that obviously need to be considered as part of our return to play. Next slide, please, Joy. In terms of the types of checks that are required, again, these are being given to us by government, but in essence, making sure that home team checks take place against those guidelines. And again, being really strict in the fact that any positive answers to the questions given, in essence, mean that a participant can't take part in that event. That also goes for the away team. So if we move to the next slide. It's actually exactly the same checks, except prior to travel. And again, any positive answers to that means that that individual shouldn't travel to a fixture. There's also guidance on the next slide again, in terms of kind of those planning around the different modes of travel that people might choose to use. And again, that's a choice for those individuals. But in all modes of travel, in essence, there is the requirement for face coverings and wherever possible social distancing. But for example, within a private vehicle, such as a car, that is much more difficult. That is still permitted under the guidelines that have been given to us. And I know one of the common questions that we've had within the National League is what does that mean in terms of our official allocations and how they travel to a game? They are absolutely no different. They are able to share a private vehicle, undertaking the same checks and safeguards. And in essence, they can travel together, and therefore there's absolutely no increased cost to the club, which again was one of the concerns given the protocols. Next slide, please, Joy. So in terms of a summary on those mitigations, then, obviously we've covered team benches, and again, just a couple of other really good sport-specific examples for us are, for example, within the penalty bench, clearly you generally can maintain social distancing in that environment unless there's a significant number of penalties, clearly. However, the proximity of you to the penalty box attendance, again, has been highlighted as one of those risks. And therefore, if you're serving a misconduct penalty, then you would not serve that penalty within the penalty bench. You'd actually serve that in a neutral area to ensure that you're both socially distanced and also not within the proximity of an individual for greater than the 15-minute time allocated. Clearly, there's lots of other parts of that, and these guidelines will be posted out to you, but we wanted to give you a flavour in terms of what's happened in the pilot series, and also what we're going to be expecting as we move through the return to play plan. Next slide, please, Joy. So again, completely appreciate this is going to be really small for you guys to read, but in essence, we have phased the return to play plan over the different areas of the sport based on the government guidance. So in essence, orange or light orange is phase 3, the dark orange is phase 2. Clearly grey is the national lockdown that we're currently in. And the light green is part of where we are looking to phase back into fixtures within an area. And then the green is in essence, as we move into the new year, looking at what competitions we can run from January moving forwards. And we've been relatively public in the fact that for the National League in particular, that this January is very much the target date for us to be moving forward on. That being said, we are going to be looking for a number of pilots to take place within the women's game, within the Division 1, and also within the juniors prior to moving to a more general pre-season and general kind of phase 4 as such. We just want to make sure that we're able to work with a couple of or a few different clubs outside of the national division of the National League to make sure that those guidelines are practical, understood, and again, to make sure that they can be applied on that local level. So don't be surprised if information comes out over the coming days to ask if you're willing to take part in a number of those pilot series events within the different leagues and structures that we've got in the EIHA. So this should be my final slide, please, Joy. So we want to make really clear that we are still waiting on confirmation from Sport England and DCMS in terms of some of the guidelines for particularly tier 2 and tier 3 areas in terms of what is and isn't allowed, both from an ice rinks perspective, but also an indoor perspective. So you will no doubt have seen, if you do follow a range of governing bodies on social media, that we have all put out previous information around basically delaying the fact that we can't release the information to you as clubs because we are waiting on that guidance. We aren't able to unfortunately publish guidance until we've got that confirmation from government. So as soon as that comes to us, that in essence will mean that we publish more of this information in the public domain. That being said, clearly we have had a number of discussions with DCMS and Sport England, particularly over the last kind of 48 to 72 hours, and therefore we have got a flavour in terms of what that might look like. So we are still looking, subject to that guidance being published, at trial fixtures taking place from Saturday the 5th of December across the other areas of the sport that are permitted to do so within the tiers that are about to be published. So one of the main questions that we've got, just to be really clear, is whether or not within a tier 2 and a tier 3 area we're able to do that, for example, with juniors. However, we have had verbal confirmation at this point that we are able to do that within the elite status. However, we've had no written confirmation of that, or what the written confirmation is on what is included within elite status following the national lockdown, because again, there's been some indication that that might change very slightly, and therefore our guidance will need to reflect that. So I'm happy to take questions in terms of the return to play as we've kind of just presented it. There are a couple of questions that have come through on the chat that I'll come to, because I'm sure people might enter some additional ones in. We've had one question, and again, just to reiterate, I won't say who it's from unless you categorically say that you're happy for me to do so. But we've had one question, which is the previous slide had blue for rec hockey. It's a really good question, and it was also the same for National League 2. In essence, that's because the previous guideline, in essence, put quite a lot of restrictions in that area. And that is one of the main questions that we've got for DCMS, is exactly what we're going to be allowed to do with anything that isn't under the exemptions that they've indicated. So the exemptions are under 18, disabled, and elite are the primary 3 exemptions that have been communicated in terms of indoor sport. What isn't clear is what that means for the rest of adult sport. So again, as soon as we've got clarity on that, we will update this chart to make clear what that means for recreational hockey and National League 2. Again, just for complete transparency, one of the indications that we've had is actually the previous educational exemption that existed for only parts of university sport that was communicated via books. The current indication is that that's not going to be in place. So actually, even though the current chart does show that that moves back into phase 3, that might actually change based on the revised guidance that's published by Sport England next week. So we had a question around EIHL2, and hopefully I've answered that. What is the plan for dealing with risks associated with the COVID environment in the event that the pandemic proves to be a greater or longer term problem? So again, a good question. Ultimately, we have to follow government guidance. So if the government tell us, as an example, that all contact sport in the UK has to stop, ultimately we are a contact sport and therefore we would need to stop activity. That being said, the majority of contact sports where that has been indicated as a risk in their guidance with DCMS have actually delivered adapted sport rather than ceasing activity. How do we put ourselves forward for the pilot trial / game if this is an option? And that question relates to the junior level. So again, an email will be coming out once we get guidance from government this week. So in essence, assuming we do get the guidance on Monday, which is the indication that we've had from Sport England, you will get notification shortly after in terms of what that trial process will look like. So sorry if I misspoke. Somebody has said that I said that Div 1 would be offered pilot games. Just for clarity, the Women's Elite and Women's Premier are currently the ones identified for pilot games because we know that that exemption still exists for those 2 levels. The Division 1 for the Women's National League falls under the same criteria, we believe, as the National League 2, the under-20s, recreational and universities, as I've already touched on. What percentage of tier 2 areas will be available, as the majority of the north will remain in tier 3 with ice rink closed at the moment? So that's one of the questions that we are still waiting on an answer for. The initial indication was that ice rinks would be required to close in a tier 3 area. And that's why we've asked everybody in the sport to promote to their local MPs, in essence, that is an incorrect classification for our facilities. We are indoor sport venues, the same as indoor sports halls and so on. And therefore, the hope is that that is going to be one of the things that changes in the guidance next week. There was a question around unis and elite. Hopefully I've already answered that one in terms of the fact that universities aren't elite. It was an educational exemption that might actually now have been removed. From a fan's perspective, is the plan that as trials are put in place for other clubs around the country, these games will also be streamed, or is this at the discretion of those clubs taking part? So this is completely at the discretion of the clubs taking part. The streaming series was obviously done so that those teams could, in essence, cover the costs of delivering those events. And if people haven't heard me say it before, I want to openly thank those 3 clubs for actually coming forward and taking the opportunity to put that series on that has allowed us to demonstrate that we are able to play our sport safely. So there's a few more questions around tier 3. What does this mean for junior training and so on? Unfortunately, we can't be any more detailed in terms of what I've just said, because we're actually, as I say, still waiting for that guidance from Sport England in DCMS on the final wording on what is and isn't included. As soon as that comes out, we'll publish that guidance in terms of what can take place in all of the 3 tiers that are obviously being published across the country. And yes, again, are rinks and their management aware of the proposed way forward? Yes, we've actually had quite extensive conversations, almost daily, in fact, with British Ice Skating and the Ice Rink Managers Association over the last week, so that we're joined up in terms of our approach to returning people back to rinks to participate in sport. So I'll just do these final 2 questions, and then we'll move on to the main topic for the meeting, because obviously this whole meeting isn't for return to play. But on paper, the phasing is clear. In practice, due to factors out of the control of some clubs, a return to hockey post-March lockdown has not even taken place. I think this is an important point for awareness of the audience, and absolutely completely recognised by ourselves and the board, and I'm sure recognised by many clubs. There's a number of venues that fundamentally haven't reopened following the initial lockdown, and obviously that decision for those venues isn't going to be any easier given the tiered restrictions that are in place. Unfortunately, we're not in a position to change that for venues. It's ultimately a venue decision, but our fight is in essence to get all of our players back on the ice as quickly as possible within the guidelines that government allows us to follow. So would the reclassification from leisure/entertainment to sport be enough for rinks to open financially if they're not able to take leisure sessions? So the indication that we've had is that if the sport element of an ice rinks business through ice skating and ice hockey is able to take place, then that does make a substantial difference in their decision in terms of whether or not they're able to continue offering activities, including to the elite level. It's fair to say that the offer of only elite sport within the current parameters, and I emphasize that, so within the 4 leagues that we operate within the EIHA, that is unlikely to be sufficient for a venue to continue to operate through this period. That being said, we have had indications that those elite parameters might be changing, and therefore that might change the position of those venues. So again, I'm sorry we can't be clearer, but as I say, we're currently waiting on that information from government. So we'll stop the questions on return to play there. If we do have time after the session, I'm happy to pick those up. But again, what I will also try to do and commit to is to publish the further guidance early next week. If there are any further questions in terms of the guidance that's being issued, then please come back to your section. Generally speaking, we are trying to make sure that any kind of FAQs that are raised as part of the return to play guidance is given to each of the sections, so that in turn they can work with their member clubs to make sure that they're informed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And probably moving on to what the meeting was advertised as, to talk more about the governance side. But before we do, I think it's really important that we're clear. You know, in our view, we've done a pretty decent job here of engaging with the relevant stakeholders, liaising with government, liaising with DCMS, securing funding from Sport England, and getting as many teams classified as elite so they can be exempt and able to play as possible. But actually, all of this was made a lot more difficult and a lot more challenging because of the fractured nature of our sport. You know, a unified, well-governed organisation would have made engagement with government a lot easier. It certainly would have made securing funding from Sport England a lot easier. And it would have ensured that instead of us having to chase to be included on initiatives with other national governing bodies, which we've now done, we would have already been on those lists. You know, we would have been recognised by key stakeholder organisations as well governed and as a trusted national governing body. So really going forward, it is critical that we have a well-governed national governing body to navigate return to play and to manage any other crisis or issue or this continuing issue and pandemic that's thrown at our sport. You know, the governance is really key to us being effective at everything. And it is absolutely key to getting you back on the ice and doing the sport that you love doing. We know there's a lot of noise out there at the moment about the timing of this vote and why unification is being tabled now in the middle of a pandemic. And you know, we're going to go through the timeline and how we've ended up in a situation where we are tabling this vote in December at a virtual meeting. However, we want to be really clear and upfront. The time for unification is now. So why is the time now? You know, we've been continuously working with you, the members, and the ice hockey community over the last 3 years. We conducted a thorough governance review, we held numerous consultation meetings, we've tweaked proposals, we brought them to votes, we further tweaked proposals. You know, this is the culmination of all of our work and conversations with you. We're not forcing a vote quickly on this. Actually, probably to the contrary, we've taken a pretty lengthy period of time to get to this point, and that time is now. If we look north of the border, Scotland voted in 2012 to become part of Ice Hockey UK, and that was on advice from Sport Scotland that our sport is too fractured and that we need a unified structure. They've been waiting for England since 2012, you know, and they are in a situation where they are going to have to sort their own governance out if England doesn't want to be part of a unified body. It's unrealistic to expect them to continue waiting and waiting for us to make our minds up about this. They are going to need to separate out if there's no chance of unification. And once they do that, that time is lost for us to unify the sport. And thirdly, it's been made very clear to us by key funding agencies that any further help, any further support to get through this period and to get through the revival period for our sport will be dependent on a good governance model being in place. Waiting to put that good governance model in place isn't an option. The time for unification is now. So how did we get here? Let's roll back a couple of years through this timeline and this journey that all of you on this call likely have been on with us. The EIHA held an EGM in November 2017 where the membership voted to set up a governance working group, and that working group was going to look into option 1, staying as a standalone English organisation, option 2, becoming part of a unified body with Scotland and Ice Hockey UK, and option X, anything else that we should be considering that actually is better than option 1 or option 2. Between November 2017 and June 2018, that working group held a variety of consultation meetings. There was an open inbox for members' views to come into, and we appointed an external consultant who ran some really useful meetings with our membership. All of those views were taken into consideration. In June 2018, the governance working group report was finalised, and that report came out with a recommendation to create a new unified NGB. That was the recommendation that was best for our sport and viewed as best for our sport after all of the consultation and conversations that we'd had. In July 2018, the EIHA board called an EGM to ask the membership, on the basis of the report, what does the membership want the board to do? The EIHA members voted for the EIHA board to work on the detail for a new unified national governing body. and bring back a full detailed proposal for the new unified national governing body for EIHA members to vote on. So it's really important to recognise that since July 2018, a unified body has been the direction of travel. That's what you, the membership, asked us to do, and that's what we have been doing. A single English body was not what you voted for and not what you asked us to work detail up on. And so that's why that isn't on the table here. So from July 2018 until July 2019, on the back of the membership ask, we established an EIHA, Ice Hockey UK joint governance steering group. We consulted with members of the EIHA, with Scottish Ice Hockey Association, with Ice Hockey UK. We created a detailed report on what the new unified NGB should look like. We created articles of association for the new national governing body. And in August 2019, the EIHA held an EGM to vote on the new unified NGB. We needed 75% majority to put this in place, and the vote failed. We got 73% majority. And so important to recognise that we narrowly missed being able to move to the new unified governing body by 2%. The board reflected on this, and at the December 2019 AGM, the board set out a timeline and a plan to bring back tweaked unification proposals. When we reflected as a board, we recognised that 73% voting in favour of unification really wasn't a failed vote. It showed that the EIHA membership wanted this, but there was some of the detail that they weren't happy with, so we needed to look at that and bring proposals back. Between December 2019 and April 2020, the EIHA board developed detail on the strategy for the new national governing body, changed the transition board arrangements in the articles, put in restrictions around EIHA assets so the transition board could not access them, set out the department and section budgets to stay the same, set out the operational structures for clarity on how the sport keeps running. So everything being presented to you, it's important to recognise it's been agreed and voted on by the board. All the votes at the board were unanimous in support for what's being tabled to you. June 2020, that was the date that the EIHA board told you we were working towards to hold an EGM to vote on setting up the new unified NGB. That was when we were going to table all of the reworked proposals and give you the opportunity to vote on it. We clearly all know that we never really got to June and coronavirus hit. At the point that it hit, we'd pretty much done all of the work. We discussed with the senior leadership team to get their input on the final proposals around kind of March, April time. And we asked them the question, you know, we've got all of this work. We promised the membership that we would have a vote in June. What do we do here? Because we're damned if we hold the meeting and do the vote in the middle of a pandemic when everyone is fighting for their lives, maybe quite literally, but also everything's been turned upside down for everyone. But if we don't hold the meeting, we look like we're not keeping to our timeline. We reflected, we listened to the senior leadership team, and we didn't hold the vote in June. We decided that, you know, let's see if we can get through this storm. When the world is all back to normal again, we can have a face-to-face meeting for this, and we can kind of work through it. So again, to bring you that timeline back up so you've got it on the screen. November 2017, you told us to set up a governance working group to determine the best way forward for the sport. Between November and June, we worked on all of the ideas, and the governance working group came back with the proposal to set up a new unified national governing body. In July 2018, you told us, yes, that's what you want us to do, set up a steering group with Ice Hockey UK and develop some more detail. From July 2018 until July 2019, we developed that detail. And then in August 2019, 73% of you voted for a new unified national governing body. Between August 2019 and April this year, we reworked those proposals to bring back, all towards working towards that June EGM date. So to say that we're rushing this through, I think is a bit far-fetched. You've waited long enough, and Scotland certainly waited much longer. We're now in a situation where the pandemic wasn't the kind of storm that we thought it was going to be. And actually the whole sports sector thought, okay, everything's on hold for a few months, but we're back to normal again after that. It's not been like that, and we're not through it yet. We're now in a situation where we have to hold an AGM before the end of this year. It's in our articles that we must hold an AGM in each calendar year. There are no exemptions that we can go through, so we have to hold one. To hold that meeting and to not table the vote doesn't seem sensible. It's an opportunity for us to table something that has been ready and waiting since April, but given the timeline for the last couple of years, you know, and we hope that you tell us to get this done so that this governance timeline review just stops. And what we can start is the future of an effective NGB, and the timeline for that can begin. So the question of, do we really want to be doing this virtually? I hope I've covered that. No, of course not. You know, back in kind of April, May time, we all hoped that we'd be able to hold an in-person meeting, you know, September, October time. It's now December and we have to have the AGM. So we're bringing the vote to it. And actually, I don't think we need to make an apology for bringing a vote to you that we promised to bring to you in June. You know, it's a timeline that we're trying to keep to, and it's a timeline that's important for us so that that timeline can end and the journey of our effective national governing body can begin. Whether we like it or not, you know, the time to decide on what we're doing going forwards is now. The paperwork is the same, whether it's a virtual meeting or an in-person meeting. The decision is the same, whether it's in-person or virtual. You know, we've all had to adapt to new ways of working and a new world. Some of us have managed that better than others, and some of us are still grappling with it. You know, we need to put aside the format of the vote and the format of the meeting and look at what the vote is about, and what approving the vote has the potential to do for our sport. We need a well-governed national governing body to come out of this pandemic, and I think we can all agree that what we have right now is just not fit for purpose. Voting this through doesn't stop us getting the sport back up and running. Actually, to the contrary, it gives us a far better chance of being effective and giving our sport a chance of coming out of this stronger and getting you all back on the ice quicker. You know, better decision making with a stronger national governing body gives funders, facility providers, government more confidence in our sport and gets us back up and running quicker. We had to find the right balance here. You know, we've been accused of lots of things, but we can't let this pandemic define us and stop all of our activity. We've got to find the right balance here between soldiering on completely oblivious to what's going on, which is not what we're doing, and at the same time not letting the pandemic cripple decision making and progress. The balance for us was not holding the EGM in June as planned, but we're now at a point where we need to hold that vote to be able to move forward. It's really clear we will not get any more support or funding if we don't improve our governance. We need to show how we're improving it, and we need to show that now. And so the vote has to come to you. Had some questions about whether I put this on the screen in an EIHA meeting. You know, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I want to be very clear that I'm not insane, and neither are my fellow directors, although I'm sure that other people will have different views on that. And I probably myself sometimes wonder, given the amount of stress that this role brings into my life, whether I am insane or not. I'm sure the same for many of you that volunteer and give hours of your time to this sport. But it's important to recognise we're not bringing back the same thing and asking for you to vote on it differently. You know, when the vote achieved 73% majority and missed by 2%, it was clear there was support for it, but we just needed to make some changes to it. And so it was our job as a board to lead and to understand why we didn't get that extra 2% that we needed. So we spoke with you, we listened to you, and we identified the issues that you had with the previous proposals. We then took each issue in turn and addressed it. So what we're bringing back to you is updated. It addresses the concerns that you raised previously, and we really believe it's the best option for our sport going forwards. And for all of the concerns that you guys have raised have been addressed. So some of those concerns, and this is an overview of the issues that you raised, 4 main issues. The first one on the transition board, the second one on the assets and the reserves of the EIHA, the third one on how does a sport keep running while we make all these governance changes, and the fourth one was it was confusing, there were too many resolutions and too many votes. So taking each of those in turn, the transition board. You told us you didn't want to see Richard Grieveson on the transition board. You told us that the way the transition board was set up was too Ice Hockey UK heavy and that you wanted to see more of an EIHA presence on it. And a reminder here for everyone that the transition board is in place for a maximum of 1 year and individuals come off as soon as their equivalent people are appointed into the new national governing body board. But we understood the concerns that you were raising and we made changes. So we removed the Ice Hockey UK chair, Richard Grieveson, from that transition board. We then negotiated a fair distribution across England, Scotland and Ice Hockey UK of representatives on that transition board. So 2 from England, 2 from Scotland and 2 from Ice Hockey UK. And each of those organisations then took a board decision on who the 2 individuals should be to represent each of them on the transition board. The transition board, as a reminder, they are tasked with effecting the setup of the new national governing body, appointing the new board members, running the election process for the new board, and then essentially stepping down. They will step down as soon as their equivalent person is elected or appointed. The maximum amount of time they can stay on there is 1 year. So to be very clear, David Hand is not eligible to be part of the new national governing body board. If any of those other individuals have not served 6 consecutive years on England or Ice Hockey UK and they want to try to be on the new national governing board, then they need to be elected by you. The transition board, in our opinion, has with these people the appropriate skills and the appropriate balance. But we're asking you not to fixate on it too much. We listened to your views, we've changed the composition of it, but it is only temporary and it is only there to get the new national governing body board in place. I'm sure that this question will be coming through. Wait, who is Travis Ward? Well, Travis was co-opted onto the EIHA board in January 2020, when we went down to 4 directors. As you will know, under the English articles, we can't operate with 4 directors. We had to co-opt in between general meetings and we co-opted Travis. The EIHA board unanimously voted for Travis and Andrew as the 2 individuals best placed to be on the transition board on behalf of the EIHA. Travis has a legal background. He worked for the National Football League in America and campaigned for LGBT rights within sport. He's on the transition board because the EIHA board unanimously believe he is the best placed person from a skills perspective to deliver some of the transition tasks. Again, to be very clear, the transition board is in place for a maximum of 1 year. So the second issue, protecting the EIHA assets. And I'm going to bring Travis in now because from this point onwards, Travis has been really critical in helping us understand the issues and making changes and fixing those for us. So you told us you didn't trust the transition board and did not want them to be able to use EIHA assets while they held their role for the 1 year period. You told us that you wanted the EIHA assets protected so they weren't used to subsidise elite programmes at the expense of recreation and grassroots programmes. And you told us that you wanted clarity that EIHA money wasn't going to be taken and used for non-EIHA type activities. Travis.
Yep, thanks, Joy. And so in response to that feedback, the board's worked pretty diligently over the last year to try to make sure that we can combat some of those concerns that were expressed by membership and your feedback. So one thing that we did is we added a restriction on the EIHA funds following the asset transfer that the new National Governing Body Transition Board can access. So essentially what we've done is we've ring-fenced 100% of the EIHA cash reserves meaning they can only be used for existing EIHA liabilities, with the exception of the passage of a special resolution. So 75% of the membership of the new NGB feel that the EIHA asset should be used for a purpose that is not an EIHA purpose, then that can obviously pass through. Or the conclusion of the transitional period, so meaning when the new board structure is in place, which can be found in Article 21 of the new draft articles, that's only the point where the new NGB could access those funding. We've also set up an operational budget for each of the different sections for the upcoming 2021-22 season, which mimics the budgets for the 2019-20 season. And so this ensures that your budgets in the EIHA for the upcoming season are going to be the same as they were last season, the last typical season that we've had. And so we're not going to have the risk of EIHA money being allocated to other areas of the sport that aren't EIHA areas. And just one final point to make on this is that the transition board of the new NGB did meet on the 4th of November. And as part of that meeting, they approved both the ring fencing of the EIHA assets as well as the commitment to the next season's operational budgets.
Thanks, Travis. I'm just checking the chat and I can see a question there. Are we going to get time for Q&A? It seems we're not getting questions answered. You absolutely will get time. We are logging the questions and we are going to come back to them at the end. So all of the questions that are in the chat will get answered and you will obviously get the chance to ask more questions, but important for us that we set up some of the answers to some of the questions that we've already had sent to us. Perfect, and I think Andrew said he's collating a few questions, which is brilliant. So the third issue that was identified and what we made changes. So you told us in terms of keeping the sport running that you understand we need to move to a strategic board, but actually you were really nervous that the sport wouldn't be able to keep running if we get rid of everyone who's currently on the board. You told us that you didn't think the role of the game advisory group was very clear. And you told us that you didn't think it was clear who would be operating the sport so that it didn't fall apart straight after the vote.
So in response to that feedback, we created some clear organizational charts which show the separation between the strategic side of our sport and the operational roles that we have. We also drafted terms of reference for both the board and the game advisory group so the membership can be sure of what those groups do and who they're composed of. And we also set out a commitment to keep the existing operational people in place. And where there are vacant slots, of course, the new transition board will seek to recruit for those roles as soon as possible. And so back to kind of keeping the sport running, we want to keep the individuals, the many volunteers who help our sport run on a daily basis in the roles that are working. And so Liz and Val are still going to be doing the registrations. Tony Lack is still going to be in charge of the fixtures. Tony Wood and Tony Boyton will still be running the recreational section. Lynn will still be handling the discipline side of the sport. And of course, the NIHL League Management Committee will still be in place. And they've been doing an excellent job even throughout this pandemic with the streaming series.
So let's be really clear here. There is an elephant in the room. And what about the junior program and the vacant roles that we have? Who's going to run juniors? And actually, I think this is where we need to say we're aware of those gaps, but we are also very aware that there are people out there who have ideas for the junior program, ideas for the coaching program. And as soon as we know the outcome of the vote and what those roles are going to be in terms of recruiting into them, we will need to fill those vacant roles. We know we need a head of juniors, we need a head of the English national team programme, a head coach for the England national team, a head of conference. All of these roles are available. And from our understanding, there are people there who want to take them up and want to do that ASAP. Voting in a new strategic structure doesn't change that. It doesn't delay any of these appointments being made. Voting in the new national governing body structure actually speeds up this process by empowering the transition board to get the operational roles filled as soon as possible. The sport has run for years due to volunteers doing operational roles, and it will continue to do this with many of those same volunteers, and hopefully with an army of new volunteers who can finally see that we have a well-governed national governing body and there are meaningful roles that they can take up and take on. The fourth issue that you identified and told us was having 9 resolutions written in legal language was really confusing. It wasn't helpful and you didn't know how best to indicate if you supported unification or not.
So one thing I tried to do when I came onto the board is ensuring that the membership is aware of what they are voting for. So we have put together the packet of supporting documents, which is on the EIHA website and has been sent out to the membership, which explains the resolutions in non-legalese, as well as the impact to the sport in both in the short, medium, and long terms. So we want to make sure that you as members are aware of what you are in fact voting for, and there is no confusion as to legal definitions or terminology. We also tried to reduce the number of resolutions. We grouped those into one set of special resolution and one set under the ordinary resolution. And so now when it comes to the unification vote, you just have 2 votes, and those are resolution 4, which includes everything to approve the new NGB, so the transfer of the EIHA assets, the adoption of the model articles under the EIHA, and essentially handing over of the sport to the new national governing body. And resolution 5, which gives you the chance to confirm some of the specifics around the sport, such as the ring fencing of the cash reserves, committing to the operational structure that we proposed, as well as the 2021-22 budgets. And so really the key resolution here, if you do support unification, is resolution 4. So resolution 5 is the ordinary resolution. Again, it just confirms some of the specifics of unification, but doesn't necessarily mean for or against unification as a whole. Resolution 4 is the key one. That's the special resolution. If you do support unification, you must vote yes for resolution 4.
So this is really how we want to use this meeting, not fighting and not arguing and not finger pointing at each other, but actually as an opportunity to give you the floor to ask the questions that you need answered, so that you can make the decision. It's a member decision here. We as a board know very strongly what we'd like that decision to be from your perspective, but you have the right to make that decision and you need to have the information that helps you make that decision. The best way of doing that is making sure that we pick up all of the questions that you've typed in, all the questions that come through now. We've tried our best in the information pack to answer questions that we'd had previously. We've tried also in this presentation to answer some of the more recent questions. We're not running away from answering any of those questions. This is your chance to make sure that you feel informed to make your choice. And we want you to go to that meeting on the 12th of December or ahead of time if you want to vote in advance, and vote with confidence that you've had all of the information that you need. Now, I know Andrew's been collating some questions. I had a couple that were really early on. So Andrew, if it's all right, I'm just going to go back up in the chat to the ones that I had early on. So I had one come in from Oxford Midnight Stars, and she had 3 questions. One was the support pack says Women's Game Advisory Group has 1 member, but the diagram shows 2. Which one is it? Women's have 2. That was a change that we made off the back of feedback from the senior leadership team. So in the articles for the new national governing body, the women's section has 2 representatives on the Game Advisory Group, and that should be correct in the support pack. For the budgeting, are women's in the senior or the juniors budget? I'll defer to Andrew to answer that one.
Sorry, Joy, can you just repeat the question? Because I think I've got one that's similar.
For the budgeting, are the women in the seniors or the junior budget?
Okay, so just to complement that question, a second question that we've got is in setting the budget for the new NGB, presumably you've looked at the previous year's accounts to inform what figures should be in the budget. Can you give us some detail on how this was put together and what assumptions were made? So I feel like those 2 questions are very similar. In essence, we took the budgets from the various associations that currently exist, and where they both generate revenue and incur costs. In essence, those were transparently put together in very much the way that you see in the information as it's presented in the accounts for each organisation. We then identified where there were transfers between those organisations to make sure that, in essence, money wasn't being double counted. So a really good example of that is clearly the EIHA pays a significant amount of money per year to Ice Hockey UK. Clearly, as a single governing body, that transfer doesn't happen. So we took that both off the income of the new NGB, but also off the expenditure. So the net balance ends up being the same. However, it gives us a much more accurate statement of income and expenditure for the new NGB. The second part of that really was then amalgamating all of that information together and producing the headline budgets. That was split into seniors, which includes the National Ice Hockey League, the Women's National Ice Hockey League, the recreational section and the university section, in the same way that that is displayed in the organisational charts that you've been given as part of the pack as well. It's exactly the same for juniors. So in essence, it's the league budget, whilst the conference budgets are under the stream of the performance programme. And all of that information, like I say, should be in your pack. There is a commitment that those funds and that allocation of funding is protected to make sure that those programs have the financial commitment that they need to continue under the current model. So hopefully that answers all of those questions.
Okay, and then the third question I had in from that lady was, how will the new organisation tackle the risk of indirect discrimination, i.e. a rule or a policy that disadvantages a group with a protected characteristic? An example could be how men's activity might be funded, but women's may not. For example, the GB competition. So I think there are probably two parts to that. The first I would say is where there's kind of funding which is dictated outside of the control of the national governing body, that's quite difficult to change. So sometimes the GB funding for the men's programme will be coming from either the International Federation or from one of the funding agencies which has specific criteria for why they're funding men's sport as opposed to women's sport. But actually I would say a unified governing body is required to comply with things like the Sport Governance Code, which sets out clear standards in terms of diversity. And so there is more chance that a well-governed organisation which is unified and has to comply with that kind of legislation and regulation is going to be able to tackle inequalities better. I also know from wearing a different hat in my day job, working at Sport England, that tackling inequalities is going to feature very heavily in the new strategy for funding sport. And so any national governing body which is building strong relationships with funders is going to have to identify that as a key area of work for them. And if they are building better relationships because they've got stakeholder management in place, then I would expect the strategy for the new national governing body to reflect the strategy for funding sport in the country. I had one other question, and he hasn't said if I can give his name or not, but there was a question around whether there is a loophole that David Hand could be appointed as a chief operating officer and therefore end up on the board of the new national governing body. There is the opportunity for the appointment of a chief operating officer. Anyone would be able to apply for that. They would then be assessed against the criteria and the skill set, and then would need to be appointed. My personal view is I'd be very surprised if David Hand was the top candidate for that role and appointed into that position, but that's my personal opinion. I'd also be very surprised if he would apply for it, given he has a day job and doesn't look to be changing from doing that.
Okay, so I've probably got about 20 questions on the list now. So if people just bear with us and we'll try and answer each of these questions. And then hopefully if you do have a further question following us answering those, then hopefully you'll already have had the answer. So First one, doesn't a transfer of assets to the new NGB require an EGM to not be part of the AGM? So I'm happy to be corrected by Travis, but in order for this process to take place, it doesn't matter what type of meeting it is. It does, however, need to be certain types of resolutions that are put forward to the membership. So in essence, that is why there is a combination of special resolutions and ordinary resolutions in the pack that's been provided to you. Is that fair, Travis?
Well said. Well said.
I have learned something then. Okay. So we've highlighted that the information has been available for a substantial period of time. Why has this information only been released a few weeks ago, and could we not have had more time to scrutinise the information to make a decision? So the latest information that we've provided has obviously only just come out, absolutely. However, this was very much a tiered consultation. So in essence, it was only the final stage 3 consultation that hadn't formally been published publicly. That being said, we did allow for that information to be shared with the leadership team that included all the section heads and various committees that the EIHA has during the summer months. They in turn were able to share that with a wider audience to try and get further feedback from members. Probably the biggest thing that has been added to the document since the summer has actually been the Q&A document, which in essence we hope is of massive benefit to everybody to be able to answer a lot of the questions that people have. What I'd also say is that we'll continue to add to that. So based on the questions from today, we'll take questions and make sure that they're also addressed within a further update for the Q&A section. The transition board has been mentioned as a process for better decision making. Just to re-emphasize, that's a transitional period. The best route is actually the formalization of the full new board that we can only do after the vote has taken place. The leagues currently aren't fit for purpose and need review. The directors that are already in place and staying on the new board have also put some of those same things in place in Scotland. Why should we have confidence in them going forward? So it's an excellent point, and actually that fundamentally comes down to how the new governing body is structured. So the new governing body isn't just about being clear on what the board is and making sure that we've got the right people in place to support those best decisions as a sport. It's also got the game advisory group as a formal process for people to feed back exactly those types of issues. I don't think we're hiding from the fact that as an organisation on a number of issues, we've not necessarily always been the best at listening. That in essence is the mechanism provided by the game advisory group and a number of those other groups that have also been identified within the formal structure for the new association. How much influence could a unified governing body have on government applications to increase the amount of funding for rinks and improve facilities within the existing rinks? So I think Joy might be potentially best answering this one in terms of what good governance means and what that means in terms of the relationship with funding organisations like Sport England, if that's okay, Joy.
Yeah, can you just repeat the question, because I've been reading the chat while you were speaking.
Yeah, no problem. So how much influence could a unified governing body have on government for applications to increase the amount of rinks and facilities available?
Funders will never give you a straight answer to this, and certainly you can go to Sport England and ask them, but they want organisations to make the best decision for their sport. But the messages that's coming out quite strongly in the actions that they're taking with other organisations is that they prefer to work with one organisation which is not fragmented as opposed to several. So in situations where there have been several governing bodies set up newly, they've asked those organisations to merge. An example is Skateboard England and GB Skateboarding. They've asked them two organisations to merge because it's easier to deal with just one organisation. So that gives us an indication that it would be easier from a funding agency perspective to deal with just one organisation. The second part of that question really looks at the governance of an organisation. And so in my day job at Sport England, which I know some people see as a conflict, is I'm a governance manager. And so I assess the governance of organisations that we give money to. And every organisation we give money to has to comply with the governance code, the sport governance code. There are 3 tiers of the governance code. Tier 1 has 7 requirements and Tier 3 has 58 requirements. At Tier 3, which is where a national governing body would be expected to be, we'd have to meet 58 requirements of that code to be in receipt of any funding. And so we'd need to be a well-governed organisation that meets 58 requirements to be in receipt of funding from them.
Thanks, Joy. So I've just moved some more questions over from the chat just for us to work through. So hopefully I'm copy and pasting and we're not repeating. So what happens if Scotland as a country decide to separate from the UK in the next couple of years? So that's an excellent question. And actually, the honest answer is it would depend on the type of separation that took place. However, from a governing body perspective, clearly we do operate a lot of competitions and structures across the whole of the UK. And the challenges that we face as a sport, therefore, would be no different. In reality, sport is already a devolved matter. So actually, our work as a sport does already need to be across the home nations of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And therefore, having a strong governing body representing all of us is really important to maintain those 4 relationships with those home nations. I don't know if there's anything else Joy would want to add from her context, knowing obviously what it's like from a Sport England perspective and their work in this area.
Just add that sport's already a devolved matter. And so government in Scotland and England and all of the devolved nations already make their own policy decisions on a sport basis. And so actually the decision on devolution may not change anything, but there'd certainly be a period of time where things would have to be worked through. And it's been made clear to us when we've had conversations with Sport Scotland that any decision on what's best for our sport and how our sport should be run shouldn't relate back to a political decision of that nature, which could take years to work through.
Okay, I'm going to try and do a few of these in rapid fire, hopefully. So somebody's commented that the legal languaging was confusing, and that was commented in the previous information, yet the new document is 116 pages long. How has that reduced confusion? I suppose we were asked for detail by the membership, so actually the length of the document is based on the detail that the members asked us to produce. We've tried where we can to put kind of the FAQs in there to try and address any of that confusion within that legal context. So if people are concerned about some of the legal jargon that may be in that document, then please do contact us on governance@eiha.co.uk with any specific question you've got on that legal information, and we will provide you with a response to that. I think one of these next questions probably does relate to that to a certain extent. The new articles appear to remove the current right of membership to be heard and gives greater autonomy to the new board. How can this be considered in the best interest of the EIHA, even though we are currently dysfunctional? So again, that is already answered in the FAQ. So ultimately, the new association, like the EIHA, is a members association. So it is ultimately the members that decide. The current board and the new board, in essence, do have much of the same autonomy and are the ultimate decision maker for the sport. Both organisations ultimately, though, are members' organisations, and if you don't, as members, like a decision that the board takes, then you as members can hold both the current board and the new board accountable under company law. So that position doesn't change. Members are at the heart of the new organisation, and therefore you as members ultimately have the say on the new organisation.
Andrew, I've got a couple that have come through to me.
Okay.
So I have one that's, how do you see the decision making working within one unified body? From experience, people in this Scottish Hockey League have made some very siloed decisions that have impacted the English players for the worst. Well, in answer to that, the unified body will make the decision from the top. There will be a principle of subsidiarity, which does mean that where decisions can be made at a local level, they will need to be, but they will need to be in line with the strategic direction, which is given by the one unified body. So from my perspective, I would see that that would be made for the benefit of all, as opposed to segmenting by nationality where that's possible. I've had another one come through, and this is from Gary Apsley. He says, Mr. Ward appears to have a significant conflict of interest between his role in the EIHA and his future role in the new national governing body. Can you please explain why he did not make this declaration like good governance requires him to? My response to this question is that there isn't a conflict of interest, in the sense that Travis has been nominated by the EIHA board to be on the transition board, which is a one-year appointment, and the transition board is fully appointed by the boards of the constituent organisations. In terms of his future role, that would be dependent on whether the English membership wanted to elect him into the new national governing body. So there is not a conflict there.
Okay, so a couple more questions. So the question was made that this might not be one for the masses, but just to address it, para ice hockey doesn't fall under the EIHA, but as an organisation, the British Para Ice Hockey Association are struggling to get information from Sport England and DCMS. Would it be possible for the EIHA and Ice Hockey UK to assist them when dealing with DCMS, as disability is still allowed to continue? And do you think the new governing body might open the door for more recognition of para ice hockey and offer new partnerships going forward? So a really good question, and actually one of the piece of information from Sport England when we asked them for an opinion last year was that actually as a sport, us working together, both as ice hockey and para ice hockey, it is critically important. And part of our strategy also makes really clear that our partnerships with organisations like British Ice Skating and the Ice Rink Managers Association are also critically important, because ultimately it's all of our sports that work together to sustain our venues. And if one part of that mix doesn't work well, then that has an impact on our venues that in essence puts their finances at risk. And therefore it's really important for all of our governing bodies in ice sports to be strong together. So I'm happy to go back to the person that sent that message. If you don't have my email, just put that in the chat and I'll send you my email, and I'm happy to work with para ice hockey to support them at this really critical time. Next question, can you confirm if the members aren't happy with the representation as part of the game advisory group, this could be raised with the nominations committee? Also, it says that each section will be responsible for running nominations and elections process for the two representatives in the game advisory group. Will there be some guidance issued to help each section run each of these elections consistently and fairly, yet independently?
Shall I take that one?
Yes, please, Jo.
So with the game advisory group, correct in the sense that each of the sections will determine the process for their nominations, but they will design that process and then that needs to be approved by the nominations committee. So the nominations committee can put out a kind of standard guidance process for each of the sections to adopt. And if the sections want to change that, they can change that, but it needs to be approved back by the nominations committee. And then in terms of if the membership don't like the makeup of the game advisory group, depending on which part of the membership you come from, you would have had input into appointing your part of that game advisory group. You wouldn't have a say on, for example, if you didn't like the 2 individuals from women, but you sat within the recreation section, because the game advisory group is an opportunity for each of the different sections to have people elected into those positions. I'm scrolling my chat and I don't seem to have anything more that's come directly to me.
That's okay. Mine's lit up, Joy. So
Okay.
I'm just seeing which we've answered and which we haven't. So just bear with me. So I'll probably pull a few questions together because there's been probably 3 or 4 around similar points. So I will try to paraphrase them. There's already currently a number of challenges in terms of the EIHA for the operating of various parts of junior hockey. Somebody appears to be writing on the screen. Sorry, I'll see if I can turn that off. Okay, so there's obviously been a number of challenges in terms of junior hockey, in terms of some people leaving the England programme as an example, but also some challenges in terms of the junior and the conference programme. Can we not make sure that these programmes are supported at this critical time and not be left to fail as a consequence of what's going on? So obviously Joy touched on this in the presentation, and we've not shied away from the fact that there are a number of roles across the sport that are currently vacant. It is absolutely a priority to make sure that those roles are filled, and the recruitment process for those will in essence start imminently. Our commitment is to have those roles filled to make sure that, as we covered in the return to play plan, that people can get back on the ice as those programs restart predominantly in the new year. I don't know if there's anything else that Joy or Travis wish to add.
No, I think that's fine. I've had a couple of questions come up. So I have one: based on the fact that most sports are suffering with income, it is prudent to assume that the income of the EIHA will decline. Based on that assumption, how long can the transition board with its salaries survive from a cash flow perspective? The transition board doesn't have salaries, and so there isn't an issue from that perspective. So I'm not sure if that question needs to be reworded to come back to us. I think it is prudent to assume that the income of the EIHA will decline, and that may have an impact on the budgets that have to run. But that's something that the board would have to look at in relation to making sure that the organisation can continue. The second question within that same chat is: what will happen to Ken Taggart? He's dedicated 3 decades to this sport. But there's no indication of giving an honorary role, but you seem to be pushing him out via an election. We're not certainly pushing him out via an election. And actually, I think he's given a lot more than 3 decades to this sport. I think he's been a coach, he's been a referee, he's been a rink owner. I think he's pretty much done every role there is in this sport. And there certainly has been discussion about how we recognise that and how we make sure that we don't forget our journey in terms of getting here. So don't think that we're pushing him out at all. Will the current directors resign if unification is not approved? I think if the membership wholeheartedly reject unification, then that is a discussion that the directors need to have. And as is the current situation, the membership have the control to remove any director that they don't want to have in post.
So we've got a request for Travis just to repeat the description on the restricted funds and the ring fencing. The question is also, can you provide assurance there is no conflict of interest in the exceptions process, please?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, based on the feedback from the membership, what we've done is we put it into the resolutions that the EIHA assets are going to be transferred as part of the transfer of assets, liabilities, and membership to the new national governing body. Can't be used for anything that isn't an EIHA liability. So if there's something that the EIHA has already incurred, then obviously the EIHA assets would need to be used to pay that debt. But if we're talking about something that's more sport-wide and doesn't deal with just the EIHA, then the transition board will not have access to that funding unless 75% of the membership approves that through a special resolution. So it's just a mechanism in place to make sure that the EIHA assets aren't then being allocated to Scottish ice hockey or Ice Hockey UK or other areas of the sport where the membership doesn't want it to go. In terms of conflict of interest, I'm guessing that this is the question of, for me and you, Andrew, we'll be on the EIHA board and on the transition board, but the mechanism in place is such that the transition board can't change that. So Andrew and I, as part of the transition board, have already agreed that is the way that the transaction is going to take place, and that those cash reserves cannot be accessed by us on the transition board. So we would have no way of making that change unless the membership has voted through a special resolution to accept the use of an EIHA asset. And even in that instance, that would be for a particular liability that has been approved. So there are several mechanisms in place to kind of prevent any conflict of interest or us abusing our power on the new board.
There was just somebody that has mentioned that we've mentioned their name, even though they didn't want it mentioning. So again, just to re-emphasize that unless you say that we will mention your name, we won't mention it. So apologies if that has happened to anybody. We will try to make sure that's doesn't happen again. Is there a possibility that membership to the NGB for registrations will become more costly? So the current obviously fees are in essence ring fenced for the next couple of years in reality. That being said, that one of the primary benefits of operating a single association is that you can find economies of scale. So a really simple example of that is the fact that instead of paying several boards to operate the sport, we are only paying one. Instead of paying several accountants to do all of our accounting and finance, we are only paying one. So if anything, having a single unified body for the sport is more likely than not to actually decrease the cost of our sport. And at that point, it's then a question in terms of the strategy of the organisation to define whether or not that surplus should go back to members through, for example, discounts in registration fees, or whether that should be invested in the sport in things like new systems to help people run their clubs and things like that. So that's the honest answer, is that it should, if anything, be cheaper. There's been a number of questions just pop in just around juniors happening this year, what's going on with juniors and so on. So if I just quickly, bear with me a second, I'll just quickly pull up a presentation just in terms of the commitment that we're making in this area. Just bear with me. I'm just trying to get it on.
Andrew, do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
It's okay. I'll just take it over, Joy.
Okay.
So hopefully everybody can see the development pathway on the screen. I'm hoping I'm going to get a nod from Joy.
Yeah.
So apologies, this isn't in presentation mode. It's just because I've got lots of things happening at once on my screen. So the development pathway, as we've got it, in essence, looks at kind of all the way from people first taking up the sport in terms of skating program all the way up to the top of the sport. Very much our commitment in terms of the 2021 season for our juniors is, as I touched on in the return to play, is initially to deliver trial events across the various levels subject to the current government guidance. And then following those trial events, we'll move into a period of local competition or flexi leagues, or however you want to term it. We then have a firm season start date to allow us to start to compete in a more traditional league structure. Obviously, that structure can't be turned around overnight, but we have had indications from Tony Lack that process can still be done quite quickly, subject to obviously teams being ready and having ice time available for their entry. A really simple example of that is that the EIHL have already started a lot of that planning, particularly in terms of the national division, so that they're in a place to move forward from January. That's absolutely no different with our performance programs. So absolutely there is a commitment to run events for Conference, England and GB to support our very best athletes. The exact program again needs to take into account those local and national restrictions, because at the moment under 16s are not currently exempt. Again, just to emphasize, that might be one of the changes that we see in the guidance issued by government this week, which in essence allows us to actually accelerate some of our plans to support our performance athletes that may not otherwise be possible. Again, absolutely, just to reiterate, training camps for all levels and fixtures for all levels are a priority to ensure that we provide a suitable programme, and equally we will plan to deliver national events wherever we possibly can. The one thing that you will notice that is missing from that is actually international events. Again, that's an area that, should restrictions allow, absolutely we would consider as an association, but we need to be realistic in the fact that there isn't currently any sign that international travel and so on will become any easier. So hopefully that has answered the number of junior questions that came through. So there's a query being raised around the balance of representation for on the new board, based on the nationalities of the new board and their various roles that they hold in the sport. So in essence, obviously, I'm sure everybody is aware that David and Alex represent Scotland. They've always been part of Scottish ice hockey, or have been for a substantial period of time. They are in essence the ones that are chosen by the Scottish members to be the representatives on the transitional board. Martin and Eric, Martin is again from Scotland, whilst Eric is obviously from England. They are independent directors of Ice Hockey UK, so whilst absolutely clearly they do come from Ice Hockey UK, they are their independent directors. And then obviously myself and Travis. Obviously Travis isn't from the UK initially, but he is obviously an EIHA director alongside myself, and we both live in England. So in essence, it's supposed to be 33% for England, 33% for Ice Hockey UK, and 33% for Scottish Ice Hockey. Clearly, once we move into those transitional roles, our roles as director, whilst clearly coming from those bodies, is to represent the interests of UK ice hockey and not fundamentally the areas that we come from. So I can't stress that strongly enough. And if you take myself as an example, I am from the university section originally. I do not just advocate for university ice hockey in my role as a director for the EIHA. I will equally give my opinion in terms of how good our coaching program is, how our senior programs are running, and so forth, because my role as a director is to take a view on our entire sport and not just the bit that I initially came from. I don't know if Joy and Travis have anything else to add for that one.
I would just add again that the transition board is only in place for that 1 year period. And I think that became an issue last time round when we brought it to vote. And actually reflecting it was quite difficult for us to understand the issue, because the EIHA membership were very clear that they didn't like any of us, didn't want us to carry on running the sport. But then when there wasn't English representation on the transition board, that wasn't good enough either. And so it's about us trying to find the right balance here. And probably that's why unanimously we decided Travis was a good option, because he has the EIHA role currently and can be on the transition board. So he doesn't have the baggage or the hatred that a lot of you have towards existing EIHA directors, but he is English represented on that transition board. But again, to stress, that's in place for 1 year. Really, the composition of the board that we should be looking at is the new national governing body composition, which is in line with what the sport codes ask of us in terms of having a board which is no more than 12, having 25% independent represented, having appointments which are open and publicly advertised with people recruited into them, having a target of 30% female or gender representation, but for our sport would be female representation on the board. So that's really the board composition we should be focusing on, less than the transition board.
Thanks, Joy. So a couple more coming through. Again, reiterating a few points that I think other people have shared. So I'll paraphrase slightly. One of the frustrations we felt is the lack of support in the past and the difficulty to provide feedback for our section. The two sections that have been highlighted are junior, conference, recreational and elite programs. How is this fixed moving forward? The predominant mechanism for feedback in the new governing body is through the game advisory group. That's obviously chosen by each of the sections to ensure that you're fairly represented and providing that 360 feedback that any good organisation needs. That being said, there's also lots of other mechanisms within that structure to be able to provide feedback. So, for example, if that was an issue with recreational ice hockey, as an example, a club or member can very much still go to somebody like Tony Boynton, provide that direct feedback to Tony, and then Tony's got that equally direct link into the board. If those mechanisms haven't worked previously, again, it comes down to how we're currently governed. And I don't think anybody has sat here to saying that we are currently a well-governed organisation. Everything that we're doing is trying to change that, and that's why we're asking for your support in what's been proposed.
Andrew, I think I'd also probably add to that the issue that we have currently around communication is there's a confusion about whether it's a kind of strategic communication or an operational communication. And so what the new national governing body does is separate that out, so that your operational heads of section that are running things are doing the operational discussion and making things happen, whereas some of the strategic challenges or the decisions that you want to then kind of challenge a bit more and raise would happen through the game advisory group. So there's more of a distinction, which makes it easier to be clearer on what the purpose of that communication is. And when you're attending a section meeting, it's about the delivery of what's happening, as opposed to opportunity to change or shape the way it's being delivered.
So somebody raised a query whether the presentation that I quickly put on the screen for people was just done whilst the meeting was taking place. If you actually would like to go back to the recording that will be on Facebook, you will note that the date of the actual creation of that document, because this is how I name the files that I do, was actually earlier in November. You would also notice that a number of the other slides within that presentation I'd hidden, in essence, to try and just show those primary 3 slides, hoping that I'd be able to do that as a presentation rather than just as the view that I was able to show you. Another question that's come in has been, has there been any formal or informal communication with the EIHC following their social media posts and statements over the last few weeks? So predominantly the EIHC has been in touch with myself as a director in the EIHA, and I've had a number of discussions with them to try and reassure them on the direction of travel that we're taking. I'd like to think there's a lot of things that we all agree on, whether that's the EIHC or the wider membership. I think we all agree, generally speaking, based on the feedback from members, that a single new governing body for the sport is absolutely what we want. The question is how we get there. And again, to reiterate our view, now is the time for that change, because in essence, by having a strong governing body moving forward, that is the best way for us to emerge from the current situation as positively as possible. And actually, that's been made clear from a funding agency's perspective, like Sport England, that they need us to reform in this way if they are going to give further financial assistance to our sport. I don't know if there's anything else that any of the other directors would like to add to that.
Just to say the same, I haven't had direct contact with the EIHC members. They haven't reached out to me directly. But I think there's a lot of alignment in terms of what we're saying. I think there's a lot of good ideas, particularly around the junior programme and what they want to do. My personal view is what they've put on the table is not a proposal for a national governing body, but it is something that can work within a unified national governing body, particularly with their focus and their attention on the junior side of things. There's opportunities for them to use the operational structure there to affect some of those views if they're the right people for those roles. I think the main discussion point which Andrew has highlighted is that, do you fix the sport from the bottom up, or do you fix it from the top down? Our view very strongly is, if you don't fix it from the top down, what you end up with is what we have now, a siloed approach, perhaps parts of it working very well, parts of it not working well, but it's certainly not all working together. And what we've experienced and through our conversations about the return to play is that we need an organisation that knows what it's doing from the top down if we're going to get any further support or funding to be able to get through this period. So fixing the governance now is going to help us get through this. Leaving the governance to last is not going to help us.
Okay, so a couple more questions. So somebody's indicated that GB and England tryouts weren't going to take place this season. Again, just to reiterate, the plan as an association is to run whatever we are allowed to run based on the government guidance. As I said, the government guidance looks like the elite sport definition is going to be changing, and therefore the plan that we shared at the very start of the presentation included the fact that our performance programs would be restarting in the new year. Again, that position has to be kept under review based on the latest guidance from government. But just to reiterate, our absolute intention is to run what we are allowed to run by government. Again, just on that kind of return to play element, do you have any indication of what phase we will be returning to when we move out of lockdown? So again, very much in line with what I just said, if the government allows us to start all our fixtures for our juniors, then the intention is to start to move forward with those trial events to allow that to take place more widely at a junior level. Ultimately, we need that guidance, however, to be published before we can make that final confirmation. So there's just a comment, the closure date for league programmes of June the 5th, 2021, with a probable restart for leagues in September 2021, is likely to be an issue for providing any recreational hockey over the summer. Does this feel like recreational hockey's been overlooked? So a really good question. In terms of the modelling on the ice time availability that we've been able to do, actually, with the intention to finish all senior hockey by the end of May still, there is actually sufficient capacity in ice time to be able to operate potentially a full recreational schedule as they would ordinarily operate within the summer months, and also partly a junior schedule. I think one of the really interesting things is whether or not that is something that our junior clubs, players and parents wish for us to deliver, and very much we need that feedback from clubs as we move back through our return to play plan. So I've had a message to say, can we please ensure the questions and statements are read exactly how they are written? Apologies if you didn't feel that was the case. That most certainly wasn't the intention. If you want to revisit a question, then more than happy for you to put that back in the chat and answer it again. So it was down to the point raised, the comment that I just made was down to the point raised about the new board being 66% from Ice Hockey UK and 66% not from England. So just to acknowledge the point behind that, so David and Alex Cram, as the Scottish representatives, are dual role holders in our sport between Scottish Ice Hockey and Ice Hockey UK. So that is true that if you take it on its simplest form. However, they are the member representatives from Scottish Ice Hockey, whilst Martin and Eric are the representatives from Ice Hockey UK, and that's clearly demonstrated in the documents that we've circulated.
Just one other point on that. So there is a lot of focus on the transitional board, and that is an important piece. But as Joy mentioned earlier, the new board structure is really what matters. And on the new board, with the nominated directors, it will be a 50-50 split. There will be 2 representatives from the EIHA or former EIHA and 2 representatives from the former Scottish Ice Hockey. So that's 66% representation, or 66% not EIHA, won't be the case in the new board structure.
So I think this is another ask from a previous question that somebody doesn't feel that we'd answered adequately, just around, can you explain why the junior programme has been left to fall apart and no action has been taken to repair the damage? Obviously, we've been over the fact that we acknowledge there's a number of roles within that junior programme that are currently vacant, and absolutely it is not the intention to allow that programme to fall apart. Quite the contrary, our commitment is to recruit into the vacant roles, both for us and the new NGB, as quickly as possible.
So I have a question that come in that's, if the chief operating officer is appointed, won't there be more non-member elected directors, i.e. the independent, which are 5, and the chair and the COO, the member elected directors? The answer to that is yes, there would be. Currently under the Sport Governance Code, you have to have 25% independent, but there are a number of national governing bodies that actually have more than that. And one thing which is under review currently, which the individual who asked this question know is happening, is there's a review of the Sport Governance Code, which is looking at diversity and representation on boards particularly. And one of the questions out for consultation at the moment is, should sports boards have more independent people to enable better diversity within their boards than elected? So I think we're in line with everything that's coming out in terms of good sport governance, to have potentially more appointed than elected directors.
So I think this is another repeat of a question, so thank you for posting it in. The current board has lost strength in numbers despite promises to increase capacity, and therefore the capacity of the board has diminished as a consequence. Why have you not responded as a board to increase this capacity? So I'm happy to give an initial answer, and then probably pass over to Joy, because she'd be aware of more of the history on this issue as well as a longer serving board member. So from my perspective, one of the challenges for us as a board is not necessarily our capacity to operate as a board. One of our primary challenges as a board is our issue in terms of operating strategically as a board versus undertaking operational functions. So really good, if I use myself as an example of that, my role as a board member is obviously to serve the wider association, and yet I've still got an operational role, for example, within the university section, which also takes up a proportion of my time. And therefore, the more people we have undertaking those senior operational roles as a sport, the better, because that is, in essence, protects our board to be able to operate at that strategic level. So again, probably a good example of that within the new structure is that we've not in the initial structure put anybody as an example as the director of performance, which is a common role descriptor to be used in our sport. We've used terms such as heads of. And part of the reason for that is, again, to give that really clear distinction so that people don't get fused between the role of a director within the organisation and the role of an operational person, such as a head of section, a head of a league management committee, or whatever it might be. I don't know if Joy wants to add anything to that.
Just that I think the EIHA board has never been in line with good governance practice in terms of its size or its composition. And so we've always continually had a challenge around that. I think that's been kind of made even worse over the last few years, because it isn't clear what the board positions are and what you need to do on the board. And so expanding the board currently wouldn't make a lot of sense, given there's a huge lack of clarity about whether it's a strategic or an operational role. And we have this vote hanging over us. I think past the 12th of December, we'll have a decision on what the sport's doing, and then it will be very clear if we're going forward with the new national governing body. We'll have a proper board in place, and that will be at full complement. If we're not going forward with the new national governing body, then an England overhaul of how the governance works and what the board composition is has to happen, and people can then be appointed into roles which are clear and that they know what they're for. I had a follow-up question on the previous one about independent directors, which says, so the independent directors could outvote the member elected directors. So a chief operating officer wouldn't be classified as an independent director. That doesn't come into, they'd be classified as an ex officio because they're a director by virtue of the role that they hold. So your independent directors currently do outvote anyway because of the number of them based on a majority voting system. So that yes is the answer to that, and that's in the articles. I don't have any more questions that have come through to me. I'm just checking, Andrew, because I might need to turn my light on. I feel like I'm sitting in the dark here if we're going to carry on. I'm happy to.
So there's been a couple of questions. So in terms of directors undertaking operational roles. So again, I'll use myself as an example within that. So I'm currently heading up the National Ice Hockey League as the director responsible for that remit, following a previous director leaving their role. Whilst clearly I'm happy to continue to supporting the National Ice Hockey League, as I said, we also need to be aware of the capacity of individuals of our sport, and therefore if there is a suitable individual to take on some of those senior leadership roles, absolutely we need to bring them into the sport, and therefore that is the reason why directors may not be intrinsically listed in their operational roles, because that has in essence been a growth of their role rather than what is in essence their primary role.
I've had one come through to me. I'll just read it out here. I think it should be made clear that the clubs are the people who can vote, and not the members of the club. And the members, in brackets, parents, should contact their clubs to make their voice heard. Also, how the amount of votes is available per club. And so this relates to our corporate membership. So our corporate membership are the teams or the clubs that sign the affiliation form to be part of that register of members. And so absolutely right, the person that's wrote this in, the people that get a vote at an AGM, the people in inverted commas are the clubs or the teams. And each of those will have a nominated individual that votes on behalf of that club or that team. And so if you are an individual within the sport, a parent, a player, a referee, a coach, then you need to make sure that you speak to the representative for your club or your team that will be casting the vote at the AGM on behalf of your club or your team. I hope that answers, but if I didn't, then please type to me again. Yeah, okay, thanks. It's confirmed. I've turned my lights on.
Pointed out that I managed to not talk on mute for an entire meeting until now. Anyway, it's been pointed out that there are a couple of comments just on the Facebook stream that I'll very quickly answer. So one is around rec hockey taking place through the summer. Absolutely, if the government allows us to run rec hockey from tomorrow, we absolutely will. And therefore, we would absolutely support that to take place through the summer months. Another person has commented around the finance being provided to the Elite League rather than being basically put back into kind of junior and kids hockey, is the way that it's phrased. So there's a number of funding packages currently available for clubs dependent on their status. The funding that the Elite League has already got an initial allocation from, and obviously we are in continuing discussions around the National Ice Hockey League, is from a reduction in spectators, first and foremost. So that was in essence what the funding was from. In essence, that still needs to be looked at based on the latest guidance from government that within a number of areas you can now have spectators again. So clearly, if you can have spectators, you arguably might not need as much financial support. And that's why, even from the National Ice Hockey League perspective, we put in further information into DCMS following that announcement on Tuesday. From a kids game perspective, and I'll say kids, even though it's much more wider than that, because it could equally support our recreational clubs and a number of other clubs, dependent on how you're constituted, is that that there's funds provided by Sport England to support people at this time, predominantly through the Small Grants Fund in certain circumstances. And what I'd openly say is if clubs don't feel they have that information, then please go onto the Sport England website or please contact your section as a club to try and get pointed in the right direction for that information. Just to reiterate though, that's a club-led application process and is not an individual application process. So it does need to be through your club.
I don't have any more questions coming through to me. I'm just looking at kind of co-hosts Andrew and Travis if you've got anything else. Otherwise, I'll pop the final couple of slides up, even though I've now turned the light on so I can stay on the meeting for hours more if people want.
I'll be honest, there's only 4 comments that I appear to be able to see on Facebook. So if there are some more, then apologies if we've not answered them, but we will go back and as I said before, commit to try and put some more information in the FAQs. So there's been a question around a previous AGM. There was a request for us to consider as a board whether an additional board member would be added, and we've not recruited one as a board. Why did that position change? So I will say what my recollection is, but I'm happy to be corrected by Joy. My recollection was that that issue was raised by the membership and the board committed to consider that request. The board chose that it wasn't the right time based on the review that should have taken place and been completed in the summer of 2020. My personal view is that if you are recruiting somebody into an organisation, they should know what they're coming into, and actually recruiting somebody into an organisation that might dissolve is not in the best interest of either that individual bringing them into our sport or in the interest of the organisation. Obviously, we did that with Travis because we were below the required numbers contained within our M&As, and therefore we were required to bring in another board member into the association. And hopefully, I've already answered the question in terms of the difference between the strategic level of a board member and the operational functions that we've got, where it is probably the most prevalent that we don't have enough capacity at that operational level.
Yeah, I've nothing to add to that, Andrew. That's fine. So if there's nothing else coming through, I've got a kind of what happens next slide. I'll give people a couple of minutes if they've got a burning question they want to type in. Okay, I can't see any questions coming in. Andrew, Travis?
Nope.
No. Okay, so what happens now? Proxy voting opens at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. So you can get in very early and it stays open until 9:59 a.m. on the 10th of December, which is 48 hours before the start of the meeting as per our articles. So because it's a virtual meeting, in line with the new legislation, you can choose to log in now and vote in advance of the meeting. You can log in now and proxy your vote to another affiliate member, or you can attend the meeting live and vote during the meeting. And what you'll find when you log in after 8 a.m. tomorrow morning is there will be a tab with the resolutions on, as shown at the bottom of the screen, and you can click on the for, against, or abstain for each of those resolutions. They don't send anywhere, and they don't get counted until the voting is switched off live in the meeting. But if you indicate your preferences and then log out, it gets saved as your indicated preferences and then counted as soon as the vote closes. So you can log in and vote yourself in advance of the meeting. You can log in as many times as you want and change your responses. Also, if you've clicked a preference ahead of the meeting and then decide that you want to attend the meeting and change it, you can do that. So if after the proxy window from tomorrow at 8 a.m. until 9:59 a.m. on the 10th of December, you've got one preference, and then a day before the meeting you want to change, you can't log back in because the proxy voting is closed, but you can log in live and change your voting preference. So there's a lot of functionality and a lot of opportunity for you guys to vote, even if you can't attend the meeting live. And I think probably the final thing for us to say is, you know, we as the English Ice Hockey Association board, we're asking you to vote for a new unified national governing body because we believe it's the best thing for our sport going forwards and it puts us in the best position possible. We hope we've given you as much information as you need to feel confident in taking that vote. But we have a lot of time between now and the 12th of December. So if you haven't got the answers that you need, then please get in touch with us. Phone us, send us emails, and we will do our very best to give you the information you need to feel confident in taking our sport in the right direction for the future. Thank you very much for everyone giving your time today. It's appreciated. And let's all hope that we're seeing each other face to face as soon as possible.
Just the final point before we close off today's meeting. We've just had one final question in the chat in terms of who sent out the voting forms. All clubs should have got an email from EIHA@lumiglobal.com. That will have gone to the designated email address within the affiliation form that was completed by your team. So as an example, if you were the club chair of a club and you put down your personal email address, the email would have gone there with all of your voting information. If you have not received your voting information, there's a couple of things just to check. The first is, please do check your spam email. I know, speaking to some clubs, that is one of the issues that people have had, is that it's gone into your junk mail. So please do double check there. If it is not in there, then please contact inquiries@eiha.co.uk and we can check the affiliation form and the email address that has been supplied to us against what in essence has been sent out by Lumi Global. Again, all of that information is based on what was completed within your affiliation form, and therefore included in the information supplied to the company that is managing the vote for the AGM. Final thank you from me, and we look forward to seeing you at the AGM in a couple of weeks' time.